Welcome to the Iran This Week podcast for the week ending June 17th, 2011. Let's head right into this week's news about Iran. On 11 June, The Guardian reported that Iran has claimed that one of its spies acted as a double agent and infiltrated the Iranian opposition movement as well as foreign intelligence units. Iranian state television broadcast a documentary showing a man, identified as Mohammad Reza Mahdi, who it said had worked his way into the heart of the opposition outside the country and even succeeded in meeting Western officials, including the U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the Vice President Joe Biden. Some opposition groups have questioned the veracity of the claims, raising the possibility that Mahdi has been arrested or forced to return to Iran as a result of pressure put on his family at home. Meanwhile, the IRNA state news agency described the program in a report published prior to its broadcast as the confessions of a man deceived by the CIA. The documentary, called A Diamond for Deception, showed a middle-aged man with gray-streaked beard who spoke about his undercover mission to collect information on Iran's enemies. According to the program, Mahdi initially introduced himself to the opposition as a diamond dealer and approached foreign governments under the guise of a top official wanting to defect from the country's Revolutionary Guard and claiming thousands of his colleagues were ready to join him. "We had meetings and discussions, and the U.S. officials said that we could rely on their help," Mahdi said in the program. "They introduced me to Hillary Clinton, and in Saudi Arabia, I had a meeting with her where she was accompanied by the Saudi Arabian Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal and a translator." Mahdi claimed that he later visited Washington after an invitation from Clinton and met other senior U.S. officials, including Vice President Biden and diplomat Dennis Ross. During his time outside Iran, Mahdi joined Amir Jahanshahri, an exiled Iranian businessman and co-founder of a group called Green Wave, which is allied with a number of Iranian diplomats who defected after the 2009 unrest. Further confusion was cast over Mahdi's claims after Kayhan, an ultra-conservative newspaper under the direct control of Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, said he had in fact been arrested and that his remarks were his confessions. Mahdi first attracted attention in the West in 2009 when he claimed he had inside information about the Iranian regime, and The Guardian was among a number of media organizations that conducted interviews with him. Mehrdad Khonsari, the editor of the opposition Khod Nevis website, who had been in touch with Mahdi in the past and had published some of his articles, told The Guardian, "It is too soon to release the truth about Mahdi. He might have acted as a double agent, and it might be similar to the case of Shahram Amiri, the nuclear scientist who Iran claimed was their man, but some others said he returned to Iran after the government threatened his family." As the anniversary of Tehran's unrest approaches, Iran is once again targeting the green opposition movement and wants to boast that it has brought it under control. On 12 June, Reuters reported that the managing director of the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines said the shipping lines planned to counter financial sanctions that have hampered it or its access to insurance by the creation of an Iranian Protection and Indemnity Fund, also known as a P&I fund. Last month, the EU targeted over 30 Iranian shipping lines holding companies as part of a wider sanctions campaign led by Western states aimed mostly at forcing Tehran to curb its nuclear energy drive. Sanctions have caused several Iranian shipping line vessels to be temporarily seized in foreign ports. The latest clampdown on its affiliates overseas pushed a major British shipping agency that used to represent the Iranian shipping lines, Johnson Stevens Agencies Limited, into bankruptcy. "We are currently pursuing the EU sanctions issue through the European Court of Justice, and if the case follows a normal course, the outcome may very well surprise the sanctioning parties," said Hossein Dajmar, Iranian Shipping Line's managing director. 5 Iranian shipping lines cargo ships were impounded in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malta last year when European banks demanded early repayment of loans. They were released after several months when the line repaid the loans. Dajmar stated that insurance was no longer a problem as Iranian insurers and the central bank had stepped in. The establishment of an Iranian P&I fund through a consortium made up of all Iranian insurers through a $1 billion guarantee fund provided by the Central Bank of Iran is one of the measures to overcome that problem, Dajmar said. Consequently, the company's fleet does not have any problems in that respect. Dajmar rejected accusations by EU and US authorities that Iran shipping lines might be involved in illegal arms shipments. On 12 June, the Wall Street Journal reported that tens of thousands of Iranians marked the second anniversary of the 2009 turbulent presidential elections that sparked an uprising with a nationwide silent march against the government on Sunday. In Tehran, about 15,000 people congregated along the capital's famous Vali Asr Avenue, historically the scene of opposition protests. Similar protests were planned in other cities. Security forces in uniform and plain clothes lined the streets trying to disperse the crowd, according to witnesses. On several occasions, anti-riot police attacked protesters with electric batons, and plainclothes besieged militia on motorcycles screamed slurs at the crowd to provoke them, according to witnesses. Opposition websites reported that at least 100 people had been arrested in Tehran by being shoved into buses and driven to unknown locations. Internet and mobile networks were disrupted throughout the day in Tehran and other big cities, and journalists were banned from covering the event. On 13 June, the Washington Post reported how 2 years ago, Iranian activists used social media sites as engines to organize massive anti-government demonstrations. But now, activists say the limitless freedoms available online are proving to be a distraction from real-world dissent. Instead of marching in the streets, the same doctors, artists, and students who led the demonstrations in 2009 are playing internet games and confining their political debates to social media sites such as Facebook, where dissent has proved less risky. We have become couch rebels, avoiding the dangers that real changes bring, said a 39-year-old Iranian artist who spends most days juggling between 2 laptops and 1,300 online friends. Our world online is like an endless party with no rules, and that keeps us very busy. The artist insisted that she be identified only by her first name, Janus, to avoid government retaliation. She said she had attended a demonstration in February, but on returning home found that all of her friends had remained online, posting news about the protests from the safety of their homes. More than anything else, the relative quiet on the streets of Tehran can be explained by the ferocity of the government crackdown that followed the protests of 2009. Dozens of protesters were killed, hundreds were arrested, and many were sentenced to long prison terms. Since then, critics of the government have preferred to vent their anger in private. But many Iranians also acknowledge that they increasingly have been drawn into virtual worlds, which serves as outlets for self-expression in forms otherwise unimaginable in a country where a boy and girl walking hand in hand along a boulevard could be arrested on charges of improper relations. Iran's government has sought to block access to Facebook since the protests that followed President Ahmad-Nejad's contested victory in the 2009 election. Organizers had used the power and speed of social media to quickly mobilize crowds. Ultimately, the authorities managed to quell the protests, but not the deep dissatisfaction within the urban middle classes. Iranians have used special software to bypass government firewalls and maintain access to Facebook, Twitter, Badoo, and other websites. Iran has one of the largest Facebook communities in the Middle East and is one of the most densely web-connected nations in the region, according to Internet World Stats. Many say that social media postings in Iran illustrate that life for those who made up the bulk of the 2009 protests is still too comfortable to risk it all in the kind of game-changing protests that have rocked other Middle Eastern nations in recent months. People see no viable alternative to the current leaders, and their stomachs are still full, said Abbas Abdi, an analyst who is critical of government policies. They are trying to live their lives. On 15 June, AFP reported that the leaders of China and Russia on Wednesday pressed President Mahmoud Ahmad-Nejad to show more cooperation to resolve the Iranian nuclear standoff in a rare meeting at a regional security summit. Presidents Hu Jintao and Dmitry Medvedev had separate meetings with Ahmadinejad, but delivered a similar message of the need to improve dialogue, as the Iranian president again denounced the West as, quote, slavers and colonizers. China urged Iran to participate in the six-party talks on nuclear energy and to take substantial steps in the respect of establishing trust and speed up the process of dialogue, the Chinese state news agency Xinhua reported. Tehran used to rely on Moscow as a dependable ally in its standoff over the nuclear program, but relations have rapidly deteriorating as Russia increased pressure on Iran after Medvedev became president. Medvedev urged Ahmadinejad to take a more constructive approach in the standoff, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, expressing concern that the issue had fallen off the radar amid uprisings in the Arab world. Although we are also very concerned about what is happening in this region, we feel it is wrong to forget about the deadlock that remains around the Iranian nuclear program, Russia's top diplomat said. The Iranian president was told of the need for more constructive cooperation with the six world powers and, most importantly, of improving transparency in his contacts with the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, Lavrov added. On 15 June, the Associated Press reported that Iran had launched a satellite into Earth orbit on Wednesday, Iran State TV reported, in a feat that is likely to raise concerns among those who fear Iran's intentions and nuclear development program. The report said the locally produced satellite, called Rasad, which translates as observation, was launched successfully by a Safir missile on Wednesday. There was no independent confirmation of the launch or of the satellite achieving orbit. This is the second satellite Iran has put into orbit. The first, named Omid, was launched in 2009. The Iranian TV report said the new satellite is designed to produce high-resolution maps. Iran's decades-long space program has raised alarms in the West because the same technology that allows missiles to launch satellites can be used to deliver warheads. The TV report said the Rasad satellite, developed by Iran's aerospace agency, weighs 34 pounds and had been designed to orbit the Earth 15 times a day at a height of 160 miles. Iran is pressing ahead with its military missile program, frequently testing missiles capable of reaching Israel, U.S. bases in the Gulf, and parts of Southeast Europe. Iran has said it wants to put its own satellites into orbit to monitor natural disasters in the earthquake-prone nation and improve its telecommunications. Iranian officials also point to America's use of satellites to monitor conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq and say they need similar capabilities for their security. Russia, North Korea, and China transfer space technology to Iran. On 15 June, Reuters reported that Iran's central bank announced a raft of measures to prop up the Rial currency on Wednesday after a rush for dollars forced a devaluation. The measures, including raising domestic interest rates, had come after the bank said earlier this week it was injecting billions of dollars into the market to stabilize the currency. Central Bank Governor Mahmoud Bahmani said the Islamic Republic would also issue more bonds and abolish a sales tax on gold to make other investments more appealing to Iranians who had rushed to buy dollars in recent weeks, depressing the value of the rial. While high prices for Iran's oil exports have replenished its foreign exchange reserves, analysts say a sanctions campaign led by Western states has made cross-border financial transactions more difficult and has contributed to pressure on the rial. The last round of sanctions by the US and Europe have been quite severe, and for the first time, sanctions began to make a difference in the capacity of Iran to operate internationally. It is being squeezed, said George Abed of the Washington-based Institute for International Finance. Central Bank Chief Bahmani had already announced that Iran would inject between $1.5 billion and $3 billion into the market every week to support the rial after the bank devalued it by more than 10% a week earlier. Rising inflation, a reduction in bank interest for savers, and a new value-added tax on gold coins have all pushed Iranians to seek hard currency as a safe haven for their wealth. Allowing banks to pay higher interest rates on savings would be a U-turn from the central bank's decision in April to slash rates from a range of 26 to 28% to 14 to 17%, below what many Iranians believe to be the real inflation rate. Many economists believe the rial, which is loosely pegged to major world currencies under a managed float, has not been allowed to devalue in line with inflation and is overvalued by at least 30%. The rial had been appreciating against the dollar for almost a decade, considering Iran's inflation rate of about 20% per year, said Nasir Shirkhani, a Beirut-based analyst. The recent weakness of the rial is partly a reflection of the inflationary pressures and also the fact that the government has been printing money to pay cash subsidies to the population. At the end of the year, President Mahmoud Ahmad-Nejad started phasing out the $100 billion annual subsidies that held down prices of essentials like food and fuel and began giving direct cash payments to families to reduce the impact of price rises. The price of bread has doubled and gasoline costs up to 7 times what it did before the subsidies were slashed last year. Javad Salehi Isfahani, a professor of economics at Virginia Tech, said Iran was propping up the rial, which he believes is overvalued by 50%, to try to avoid soaring inflation as the subsidy reform takes effect. The only reason why at this time it is important to prevent the rial from devaluing too much is to prevent inflation that would undo the subsidy reform. The success of that reform is riding on keeping inflation down at this point, Isfahani said. On 17 June, AFP reported that 2 Iranian doctors who were jailed 3 years ago for allegedly plotting to overthrow the government were awarded a global health prize for their efforts to treat patients with HIV. Kamyar and Arish Alaei were arrested in June 2008 and accused of communicating with the United States in a bid to unseat the regime of Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmad-Nejad. Khonsari, age 37, was released several months ago and was on hand to accept the award in Washington, but his elder brother Arash, age 42, remains in Tehran's Evin prison, where he is serving a 6-year sentence. Khonsari served 2.5 years, a term he remembers as 870 days or 3,800 hours, and is hopeful that Arash will be eligible for release soon because he has now served half his sentence. The pair, known for their efforts to help drug addicts infected with HIV and improve conditions for sick prisoners, were not allowed to work as doctors while behind bars. Instead, Khonsari said they took on the role of peer counselors, teaching fellow prisoners about basics such as hand washing and holding informal talks with them about HIV, tuberculosis, and infectious diseases. The Alaei brothers are regarded as pioneers of AIDS treatment in Iran, where discussions about sex and drugs are often taboo. Physicians for Human Rights helped organize a letter-writing campaign across 80 countries urging the brothers' release. The appeal has been to allow the brothers to do their work, said Susanna Sirkin, deputy director of PHR. This is not a political campaign. This is a campaign by colleagues, many of whom know the brothers and their work directly because they have worked in concert with them or been inspired by their pioneering efforts inside Iran. Khonsari said he was detained when he took a summer break from his U.S. studies and went to work in Iran for a few months, and has been unable to understand why he was jailed. When you do some good, you don't expect to be in prison, Khonsari said. And that concludes the news roundup for this week. Please send any feedback on those stories to IranThisWeek@artkeller.com. And now it's time for questions and comments from the desk of Art Keller. This week, my guest is Dr. Mehrdad Khonsari of the Center for Arab and Iranian Studies and co-founder and Secretary General of the Iranian Green Wave Opposition Group, the group which was targeted by the documentary A Diamond for Deception, which was discussed in the first story of this week's news roundup. Even though it has been an extremely busy week for Dr. Khonsari, he was kind enough to make time to speak with me. With no further ado, here's my discussion with Dr. Mehrdad Khonsari of the Green Wave. Dr. Khonsari, thank you for joining me on the Iran This Week podcast. First off, the recent demonstrations, they were called for by the Path of Green Hope. And I was speaking to someone last week on the 7th of June, and they said they didn't know if they would take place. Now, it sounds like some did take place, and there was some violence, but nothing like the extent of the problems after 2009. I saw some brief clips on YouTube, but there wasn't very extensive coverage. Do you think that was because the internet is so heavily censored now, or because the scope of the demonstrations was more limited this time?
Well, I think that, first of all, the scope of the demonstrations were limited, mainly due to the fact that most responsible Iranian leaders were of the view that the security authorities were well prepared to meet any challenge at that particular time, and were simply not willing to subject ordinary citizens to abuse and to humiliation at the hands of the security authorities at a time and moment when they were most expected. Nonetheless, many people did try to stage some form of a symbolic gesture, and of course there were reports that a number of people had been arrested both in Tehran and in the provinces. But by and large, the political leaders have become smart. They have learned from the experiences of the past that you have to surprise the regime and not allow yourself to feed into the hands of their expectations and so on.
That certainly makes sense. And in fact, I said more or less the same thing on the podcast, that I was very much afraid that coming on the heels of the unrest in Syria, which is very upsetting to the regime, that any major demonstrations might provoke a bloodbath. But so I do think it was wise not to do it, as you said, in a predictable schedule. But there was an interesting report in the Washington Post on the 13th, and I would like to get your opinion on it. It recalls to me something of the Marxist propaganda of the old days. There was a quote that said, "Religion was the opiate of the masses." This wasn't about religion, but it was talking about social media and how these days people, social media in 2009, Facebook, Twitter, and that was used to help organize protests. But these days, a lot of people are just staying home on avoiding the protests and just venting there because they would rather express discontent there where it is safer. Do you think that's true? And is it sapping the strength of the protest movement, or is it just shifting it into an alternate venue?
No, I think that you have to bear in mind that the important thing is that the regime has been able in the past 30 years to instill fear into the hearts of ordinary citizens. And whilst on occasions where they have permitted a measure of freedom, you have seen how the people have reacted, whether it was in electing Khatami in 97 or turning up in their millions 2 years ago. The fact is that until such time that fear is transferred from the hearts of the Iranian people into the hearts of their oppressors. I don't know if you heard about this Iranian TV documentary that was aired last week.
I did. In fact, one of the people I've talked to in the past, Nick Kosar, who runs Code Nevis.
That's right.
Was quoted in a recent Guardian article about it. What's your feeling on that?
Well, I mean, it's just one of those great Soviet-like propaganda campaigns in trying to discredit anybody who is trying to oppose the current system and making up stories. And I and Mr. Jahan Shahi, the founder of Green Wave, are featured in this, and
yeah, it mentioned former Iranian diplomats, and my head immediately jumped to you when I read that.
Yes, well, it was me. But the lengths to which they have come, I mean, it's just like reading some sort of a fiction, a very low-class fiction. You have people like John le Carré who write a beautiful story, but this is nothing like that. I mean, it's like some elementary kid, come up with some really ridiculous scenarios, that this chap flew to Washington. He was met by Vice President Biden and then met Hillary Clinton, and then she took him to see Prince Saud bin Faisal of Saudi Arabia and all kinds of, ridiculous bullshit.
Yeah.
The thing is that the interesting feature of this television documentary is that it showed the extent of disarray that exists amongst Iran's intelligence community. Because the aim of this project and this TV documentary was to try and discredit the Iranian opposition, to show how easy it is to infiltrate them and how easy it is to deceive them and to make fools out of them. This man, IRGC General Madhi, who was playing the central role in this documentary, was a guy who had been sent by the Ministry of Intelligence to fulfill this mission. Yet at the same time, the Daily Kayhan and the IRNA, the official news agency, issued stories that this man was an anti-revolutionary element who had been apprehended by the Islamic authorities and who had then gone on to make certain confessions. Now, if the guy is making confessions, then it's obvious that whatever is the scenario of that TV documentary, the script has been written by somebody in the Ministry of Intelligence, and all he has done is to just read out the text that had been placed in front of him. So they themselves, by virtue of their own behavior, not of anything that we have said or done, invalidated the credibility of their own story or any credibility it might have had, and it just rendered it null and void.
Indeed, and if there's anything that Maziar Bahari's recent memoir makes clear, it's the off-the-wall claims common in forced confessions in Iranian prisons.
You have to bear in mind that Grand Ayatollah Shariat Madari was forced to confess that he was party to a military coup. The head of the Tudeh party, an old communist, 50 years background, came and made a confession that he had seen the light of Islam. If you are being held by people of this nature, you will say anything. Everybody takes that for granted. It's like the old-style Soviet confessions, that we used to see on TV and radio during the heydays of the Cold War.
Indeed. I've been following Iranian stuff for about 15 years on and off. I got more serious when I served at the CIA for about 7 years, and I was following more closely, specifically Iran's missile and nuclear program. But part of the reasons behind this podcast was to look at Iran in a broader light, because Iran is not, as is often portrayed in the West, just a country that creates problems over missile and nuclear issues. So I also spent a lot of time reading and studying Soviet history, and they were very keen to discredit every opposition figures, even going back to the very birth of the Soviet state. That was one of the most important things they did. So it's not too surprising that a similarly autocratic regime also finds that discrediting opposition as one of their number one priorities.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right about that. And this was a very weak attempt. Of course, we had a press conference regarding this issue yesterday, and we said that in our view, IRGC General Maty was neither an infiltrator nor a spy of the Islamic regime. And we said that we don't see him in those terms because based on our experience and based on the way that this entire episode had panned out before our eyes, it just didn't make sense. Because if this guy was a spy, if he was trying to infiltrate our organization, he would have to stick around. And, we had a press conference, and shortly after the press conference that we announced the fact that we were going to try and do things together, this guy disappeared. Why would the intelligence organization burn this man so quickly without him being in charge of a single iota of information regarding our networks or our activities? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there are, of course, many other reasons, besides the fact that he had gone through certain procedures that, based on your experience, you're well aware of. Right. Minus those procedures, we would not have advanced to the stage of holding a press conference with him.
Indeed, and I think Nick Kosar rightly pointed out that it seems to me the correct parallel here is what happened to Shahram Amiri, essentially forced to go back and confess through what I believe was pressure put on his family, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if it later comes out that that's precisely what happened here.
I think that it was much more sinister than that. Nothing in this world is 100%, but, people like myself, we have been around as well, and we have seen people, and sometimes we can get conned. I certainly don't put it beyond anyone conning me, but there are limits to that as well. So I just don't buy that.
Just a quick follow-up. When you say more sinister, what do you mean by that?
I just don't think that he would have gone back to Iran of his own free will.
No, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
No. And some suggest that he could have been lured back on financial incentives. But, people like him know what it means to go back if you have done certain things in the way that he had behaved. In other words, he is too savvy to believe whatever promises that were made to him. You know what I mean? And
indeed.
He was not a simpleton. This guy was not stupid.
Right. You don't get to senior ranks by being stupid.
No, he wasn't. One of the tactics that was used by the regime in terms of timing for the release of this TV documentary was to allow it to coincide with this time period so that people, especially outside, instead of focusing on supporting the people to demonstrate or to show their distaste for what the regime has done, to become engaged in this fruitless debate about these pointless allegations which mean nothing and are nothing other than just mere rumors. And of course, there are plenty of people in the media in the United States who are in one way or another associated with their intel organization and do their biddings. And of course, they have been quite successful in that. And that is a terrible tragedy for the Iranian opposition.
One point of confusion a friend of mine had was that the Green Movement is putatively led by two people, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi. And then a man called Ardashir Arjamand is the spokesman of a related thing called the Path of Green Hope. One thing that's not clear, he is, as far as I know, the only public face of that, and none of the other people who are associated with that leadership council are public, even those who don't live in Iran. So what's not clear to me is exactly how close is that connection. I'm told that a spokesman for Karoubi said he has no connection to the Path of Green Hope. So I'm just a little confused. Is the Path of Green Hope directly connected, or is the fact that Arjaman is the only one who's speaking on the record publicly simply to protect other people?
I honestly don't know myself because I don't know very much about the Path of Green Movement or whatever. I think that, as I understand it, Mr. Arjumand is the spokesman for Mr. Mousavi and not anything else. I do know Mr. Vahedi, the guy who represents Mr. Karoubi, and I understand that he is not on this committee or whatever, but I just follow that very remotely. I'm not too well abreast of that.
One final question. There is a little blurb in a regime paper saying that Ahmad-Nejad was trying to take control of the Martyr Foundation. Now, because I've been following Iran, I know what the bonyads are, but a lot of people don't. Can you just give my listeners a little context of what those foundations do and why it's significant that Ahmad-Nejad might want to take control of them?
Well, I think the significance of Ahmadinejad wanting to take control of that, rather like the significance of Ahmadinejad wanting to present himself in charge of the portfolio for the oil ministry, is to indicate to key sectors within the ruling establishment that he is in charge of a great deal of money and he can control the flow of money from within the system. This is what is an important attribute from which Ahmadinejad derives his influence and the kind of power that has enabled him to do a great many things, as well as to challenge Khamenei in a way that no previous president had ever done in the history of the Islamic Republic. So the foundations, and especially the Martyrs Foundation, which is the successor to the old Pahlavi Foundation, is a highly endowed, rich establishment that is in charge of a great deal of funds for which there is virtually no accountability. And it's easy picking for somebody like Ahmadinejad to allocate funds in different directions or in whichever direction he wants without being able to be answerable to anyone, especially people now in Parliament who are scrutinizing his behavior and trying to curtail his flexibility. So by being able to assert himself, he gives himself greater flexibility and indicates to key sectors like people of the Revolutionary Guards that he is able to financially take care of them if they toed his line.
That's great context and background. Hopefully on another occasion we can talk again. Dr. Khonsari, thank you for your time and for coming on the podcast, and I hope to speak with you again in the future.
Thank you very much, and good luck to you.
I hope you enjoyed my discussion with Dr. Khonsari. If the listeners noticed a non sequitur or two during the podcast, that is because we suffered technical difficulties and were forced to stop and restart recording on 3 separate occasions. I thank Dr. Khonsari for his patience in dealing with those issues. Please send any questions or comments about the podcast to IranThisWeek@artkeller.com. Goodbye and Khoda Hafez.